Well, ladies and gentlemen, we just got done with an incredible panel discussion. And on the other side, we're now going to be joined by Andrew Tsonchev, the Director of Technology, Darktrace UK, who's going to be talking on operational integrity, safeguarding your OT systems with cyber AI. Well, Andrew, a technical expert on cybersecurity, and he's somebody who advises Darktrace's strategic customers on advanced threat defense, AI, and autonomous response. His comments on cybersecurity and the threat to critical national infrastructure have been reported in international media, including the CNBC and BBC World. Well, with this, I'd now like to call upon Andrew on the stage and stream. Over to you.
Hello, and welcome to this session on operational integrity, safeguarding your OT systems with cyber AI. My name is Andrew Tsonchev. I am the Director of Technology at Darktrace. And for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about attacks on OT environments, some of the key trends and challenges that our customers face at the minute, and think about the evolution of OT attacks and how they've developed and where they might be going from here. And I'm going to use that to motivate certain ideas that we advocate in terms of defending and protecting these environments, specifically the need for using certain forms of machine learning techniques to detect and potentially respond autonomously to threats that hit OT and ICS environments. So I'm going to start by just making some comments about the attack landscape. Listed here are some of the main categories and challenges that customers in industrial verticals face at the minute. The old favorite when thinking about ICS and SCADA security has always been the sort of nation state deliberate OT targeted bespoke attacks like Stuxnet and Triton and Indestroyer. And I'll say some more about those later, but they sit at one side of the spectrum of highly bespoke, highly advanced and targeted attacks that are very challenging to detect and typically affect a small number of victim organizations. But over the last few years, a really important trend has been the comparative growth alongside that of more commodity-based attacks now being able to affect OT environments. I'm thinking primarily about ransomware, like ECANs and others, that have more and more over the last few years resulted in operational outages of production environments and caused significant financial loss to companies affected as a result. And what's enabled that primarily has been OT-IT convergence and the increased opportunity for malware to spread and manually driven attacks to move laterally from IT networks and business networks into previously more isolated and protected separate OT environments. So that's become almost as concerning a threat vector as the more traditionally focused on dedicated OT specific attacks in the environments. And there's also the threat of industrial espionage, which sometimes gets forgotten about talking about the risks to availability of control system, but confidentiality can be very important for these environments as well. And one of the other challenges is the challenges posed by the widening skill gap. And this is a really important one because it's fairly difficult these days to find suitably skilled individuals who can do IT security, let alone individuals who can do OT security, who have that convergent skill set of both a security analyst mindset and the domain expertise of understanding and working with OT systems to be able to interpret specific events and their significance that you get inside control systems. So there's room and scope there for technology to help with that problem, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But I think that kind of sets a scene for the overall attack landscape that I want to talk about. So if we focus on that selection of attacks that I mentioned, which are the high profile, often nation state, but not necessarily ICS specific attacks, where the goal is the direct and deliberate compromise of the control system, usually resulting in something like the reprogramming of PLCs and controllers. And these are probably the most famous attacks of recent years listed on this in this slide. And there's some comparisons made there. And there are some things that are constant throughout these and some things that are different. So the initial infection vector can vary. Sometimes, like with Stuxnet, it's USB based. Sometimes, like with Havex, it's watering hole attacks. It could start from phishing attacks. It could start in the IT network. It could be brought directly into the OT network. So there's some variety in that. But once the attacker has a foothold, the way the attack plays out along the kill chain is relatively consistent. And it's interestingly extended or prolonged compared to IT. So you have a longer kill chain. That means that it typically takes longer for the attacker to complete the stages of reconnaissance, lateral movement, exploitation, rinse and repeat until they reach their end target. And that's because they typically have further to go. The destination systems, whether it's PLCs or like in the case of Triton safety systems, they're typically deep within the purview layers of a control system. So there's more burying down to be done by the malware or the attacker in the environment. And the environments are typically unique or less standardized, so that the attacker, when they land in the environment, they have comparatively more work to do in terms of reconnaissance and figuring out how to move and progress to the next steps of their environment. It's less paint by numbers. It's more a thoughtful exercise in understanding the lay of the land and decision-making about how to progress in the attack and avoid detection. One thing that is relatively constant, in fact, totally constant throughout these attacks, is the use of command and control. And that's unavoidable because these attacks involve hands on keyboards. They involve operators on the other end of the connection driving the malware in these environments and making decisions about how to continue with that kill chain. And that means that they need the tether to the outside world from their implants. And it means that it's a really good way to detect these attacks because there's comparatively to IT environments less internet connectivity from OT systems. It's usually a more isolated and controlled environment. And the command and control channel is often the best way to detect the presence of something in the environment that shouldn't be there. This is a really important point because I'm going to come back to this later of what the implications for our defensive strategy might be if attackers didn't need to rely upon command and control so heavily in the environment. The other trend I want to pull out is a one of difference between these. And you can see a column on that chart which says malware, effort, or cost. There's been a overall progression from higher to lower malware and effort and cost. And what I mean by that is that the more recent attacks are characterized more by the reuse of standard existing IT commodity malware with the addition of OT-specific payloads and modules bolted onto them, rather than a from scratch, from the ground up, OT-specific bespoke piece of malware. And this is important because it shows us the motivation in attacker thought processes of striving to reduce the effort and the cost and the R&D time and the development procedures to execute these attacks. And the reason why is pretty straightforward. It's that attackers are return on investment motivated, and they want as much as possible to minimize the cost and effort in executing a successful attack campaign, as that will allow them to attack more targets. So it's an important trend, which I'll come back to, but we should think about the idea that the cost involved in executing an attack is beneficial to defenders because it exerts a limiting factor on how wide the scale of the attack can be. If you can carry out an attack much more cheaply and with much less effort, then you can target many more targets and repeat your attack many times. If it's incredibly cost prohibitive to execute a successful attack, then you're forced by necessity to restrict your target to very high profile individual targets. So that's an important concept. So just summarizing what I've said there, here's some important trends. The increased use of commodity malware where possible, the continued use of command and control. And what we're going to come on to now is to talk about the trend of moving towards using machine learning or AI in malicious cyber operations. So let's think about AI attacks and what that might mean and why that might be desirable for the bad guys. So it comes off the back of the point I was just making about efficiency, lowering cost, and replication. So if you have to run an attack manually and you have to be making decisions and hands on keyboard, and if you have to be designing custom malware before you target the environment, then that means that you are designing a tailor-made attack, both in terms of the tools and the way you execute it for the target in question. And if you just sent generic malware out into the wild, it wouldn't be very effective at successfully compromising the very unique and bespoke OT environments that attackers want to gain access to. So AI powered attacks become relevant and important because AI allows a mechanism for automating that tailoring process. It allows for having one toolkit or one system that is generic, but is able to adapt the way that it executes depending on the environment that it's in. And we've seen the beginnings of this with polymorphic malware, but that's very simple. That's just altering the form of the malware to blend in different environments and avoid detection. But once the malware will actually dynamically adjust its execution path, and it will pick different ways of behaving in the environment, and it can replicate decision making, then you have the potential of an autonomous payload that can be deployed into environments and will seek out and execute its own kill chain inside the environment dynamically based on observations and decision making in that location. Essentially replicating what humans do these days manually in the environment. And you can see how if that was possible, then suddenly the door is open to attacking hundreds of thousands, millions of targets, rather than restricting your attacks to few individual high-profile targets. So the scale can be increased massively. Another aspect is to reduce that need for command and control that I mentioned as one of the most effective ways we have today of detecting compromises in these environments. If your malware is autonomous and is decision-making for itself, you don't need the command and control. You don't have to maintain a connection to a human operator. And that means that detection is far more difficult and blending in is much easier, and remaining undetected is much more possible for the longer period of time that is characteristic of that extended kill chain in isolated OT environments that I mentioned. And the final piece here is that that blending in can be done better by machine learning systems. I'm going to talk in a second about the way our technology works on the defensive side, but essentially its job is to analyze data and understand behavior. And we use that to catch bad guys. But bad guys can use the same techniques to blend in, to understand what typical behavior is, and so then hide within that in plain sight. And that's something that's very concerning because that will increase the stealthiness of attacks significantly if attackers begin to use this. So we're very concerned about this. And before I talk about the defensive piece, I just want to illustrate these concepts a bit with a particular example of Triton and what a Triton 2.0 attack might look like if it was incorporating machine learning and AI elements in its execution. So here's a little toy diagram of that kill chain that I talked about, just to kind of give us something to talk about. So you can imagine, like most of these attacks, it begins in the top left with the compromise of an initial system. Maybe it's a phishing email, maybe it's a USB stick, maybe it came in from IT systems or from the cloud. From that point forward, you have this typical path of reconnaissance, data gathering, scanning, identifying potential targets to move laterally. You're typically moving from systems until you hit a domain controller, then you compromise a domain, then you hop to the next domain. There's often several domains nested before you get down to the PLC level, and you're trying to iterate your way down through the layers of increasing security and isolation till you get to that lower level in the Purdue model of the controllers and the industrial devices. And then at that point, typically you are trying to interact directly with PLCs and reprogram them or alter set points or change firmware or whatever it is to either disrupt the control system or pretend that everything's fine when it isn't, or something like that in the environment. So if we think about the goals that threat actors have, they have persistence, they need to remain in the environment. And we talked about that, about how machine learning enables you to blend in. Polymorphism is essentially what I mentioned before, the ability to avoid rules and signatures and detection technology by looking different. And monetization obviously is the ultimate goal, and the considerations I said earlier about reducing barriers to entry in terms of development cost directly affects monetization. So with these goals in mind, let's think about what a machine learning enabled version of Triton would look like. So Triton followed the kind of steps that I mentioned. So let's go through them quickly. So in that first stage of reconnaissance, instead of manually firing off mmap scans and getting the results and picking targets with open ports and knowing vulnerabilities on them to move laterally, you can do a form of passive reconnaissance, which is far less noisy and intrusive, which is if you have a machine learning system, you can simply watch the communication that you can see from your vantage point of other systems, and you can passively map the environment. You can understand common communication paths, dependencies, conduits, and you can model a simulated version of the environment, and you can pick an appropriate target to move to laterally that would minimize detection by staying as close as possible to what other legitimate technologies do in the environment, and maximizing the chances of success by picking targets that look like they might be vulnerable passively from the information that you've gathered. And that will mean that at that stage, you'll be able to effectively perform reconnaissance efficiently and with a far reduced detection footprint in the environment. And then when you go into accessing these systems and trying to compromise them, the way to think about this is that what a human's often doing is they are weighing up risk in their mind. They're saying, okay, if I try to compromise this system, it has a certain level of chance of success and it'll be kind of noisy and I might get detected, versus how attractive that target is. How likely is it that that target will allow me to move further and escalate my access? What kind of a system is it? What data is likely to be on there that would help me in my goal of getting to the end target? And that's what a human operator does, but that's the sort of thing that machine learning can replicate as well. So you're doing a sort of game theory approach of optimizing choices to weigh detection against advancing your goals. And if you can't find a path that has a favorable ratio, then you can fall back on more reconnaissance. Or you could go dead entirely. So you could have malware that you send out, and if it lands in an environment where it can't effectively execute towards its end goal without detection, then that malware can just automatically switch itself off and remain dormant. And that way you can reduce the chance of detection and giving away the broader campaign that you might have if you sent it to many, many targets. And then this same principle extends to the final part of the kill chain. Once you've got your systems compromised and you have to maintain persistence, you're typically polling or checking every now and then that the system, maybe it's a PLC that you compromised, is still under your control, hasn't been reverted by some kind of normal update process in the environment. Triton fell foul of this, of tripping a redundant mechanism when it was polling for persistence. So you don't need to do that. You can instead observe other interactions, and if you see other systems talking to the PLC that you want to maintain control of, you can work out the chance, based on what you've seen, that persistence has been lost. Does it look like there's a good chance that the system has had an update based on the communications and what systems have talked to it? If there is a good chance, then and only then would you risk giving yourself away by actively interrogating the system to check if you still have control. Otherwise, there's no need to. You don't have to blindly follow a once every day schedule. Your malware can be more intelligent than that, and it can only act when necessary. So these kinds of concepts, I hope, kind of put some flesh on the bones of the idea of how machine learning and AI techniques would allow something like Triton to be a lot more effective at executing on its goals, executing at scale, and remaining undetected in the environment. So with that said, as a sort of motivation of where we're going, I want to briefly talk about the flip side of that, which is the defensive side, the good guy side, if you like. So the same principles apply. Rather than using rules and signatures and looking for previously seen attacks, what you can do instead is you can learn from the data what the typical behavior of a control system environment looks like. You can train machine learning systems to understand that behavior, model the typical patterns of life of every device and every user in the environment. And then from that, identify changes in behavior that are indicative of an attacker in the environment or attempting to get into the environment. And so once you do that without rules or signatures, you're not limited to previously seen attacks. And you can also autonomously respond. And that's really important as well, because a lot of these attacks, especially ransomware that can spread in from IT environments, can move really, really rapidly. And you want to be able to respond to them instantly, rather than waiting for a human to look at alerts, review them, investigate them, etc. And so if you understand the environment, that same knowledge can be used to contain threats as well. And finally, you need to be able to deal with that skills shortage that I mentioned. you need some kind of capacity to automatically investigate and triage and automate a lot of the work that analysts have to do when they're going through alerts to understand potential incidents. So the technology that we have for this, Darktrace, we call it immune system technology, an immune system approach. And it passively learns that concept of self for all the devices in the environment by looking at network data primarily in OT environments. Build those models and then identify those changes in behavior. And that means that it can detect not just cyber attack, but anything that causes a threat to the control system, because it's just looking for change and deviation. It also means that it works the same way in IT as in OT, which is really nice, because it's not using threat intelligence or rules, or it's not pre-configured to support a particular kind of system. It's just analyzing data from scratch to understand behavior. So it works regardless of the technology stack. And that's really important in giving organizations a unified detection layer across IT and OT to help manage the risks that come from IT-OT integration. And it also means that it's agnostic to the kinds of systems you find within a control system. And there's a very long tail of exotic and unusual and legacy systems that you find in OT environments. So being able to support all of those is really important. So the platform that we have at Darktrace that is our instantiation of those machine learning ideas is as follows. We gather data. You can see along the bottom there the different sorts of data we look at. It could be email, it can be connections to cloud or SaaS environments, it can be endpoint sensors, or in OT environments, it's typically network data passively gathered from the industrial network. All that goes into training those models, and then they drive our three capabilities of detect, investigate, and respond along the top. And detect is that piece that I've talked about. Investigation takes those alerts and it replicates the kinds of steps that a human analyst goes through when they are investigating an alert to understand timelines, piece together events, pivot out from the initial alert to broaden the scope and understand the full impact on the environment of the attack, and then automate a report writing process for that. And then the response piece is you've got those machine learning models, you understand behavior. If you've got a compromised system, you can contain the threat by enforcing good behavior back on it. And this means that you don't interfere with the normal essential processes of interaction that system performs regularly in the environment. You allow those to go on because you have them in your model for good behavior, but you can surgically prevent and block all the stuff that's outside that. So you can prevent the actions of the malware running on the system, but leave the legitimate software or user actions intact in the environment. So that's the Darktrace platform. I hope that made sense in terms of the explanation of the threat landscape, where we think things are going, what's characteristic about OT attacks, and an explanation of machine learning concepts in response to that on the defensive side, and how we have gone about implementing those in the defense of OT environments for our customers. If you'd like to know more about this, or you'd like to talk about how this could fit into your environment, please do get in touch with us. We're always available to discuss specifics and talk through case studies. If you want to try the technology, we are always willing to do a no obligation 30-day free trial where you can deploy the technology in your environment and see how it operates, learning on your data and modeling your systems and detecting behavior inside your networks. So thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.